The gavel slammed down like a gunshot, echoing through the freezing mud of the Montana Territory. A rope tightened around the girl's neck, the rough burlap sack over her head, trembling with her silent sobs. The auctioneer, a man with a smile like a jagged fence, spat on the ground. "Do I hear $5 for the mute? Look at her! Strong back, even if her face is cursed enough to stop a clock." The crowd jeered, throwing stones at the hooded figure. Then a shadow fell over them, massive, scarred, and smelling of pine and old blood. "I'll give you 50 gold pieces," a deep voice rumbled, "if you never speak to her again." The crowd went silent. The beast of the mountain had just bought a bride. The year was 1874, and the winter had come early to the Montana Territory, turning the boomtown of Dead Horse Creek into a mire of slush, horse manure, and frozen desperation. The wind howled down from the peaks of the Bitterroot Range, cutting through wool coats and freezing beards, but the cold didn't stop the crowd gathering outside the sheriff's station. They weren't there for justice, they were there for the spectacle. Thaddeus Rourke stood on a makeshift wooden crate, the heel of his polished boot digging into the rotting wood. He was a man who wore his greed like a second skin, dressed in a suit that was too fine for the frontier, with a gold watch chain that glinted mockingly in the grey light. Beside him, tethered to a hitching post usually reserved for wayward livestock, stood a woman. She was small, her figure hidden beneath layers of filthy, oversized rags that looked like they had been stripped from a dead miner. But it was the burlap sack over her head that drew the eyes of the miners, trappers, and drifters. A thick length of hemp rope was knotted around her neck, securing the hood in place, leaving only her hands visible. They were bound in front of her, raw and red from the biting cold. Step up, gentlemen," Thaddeus bellowed, his voice carrying a practiced, oily charm. "What you see here is a tragedy of nature, a burden I can no longer bear. My late brother's stepdaughter, left in my care, a mute, dumb as a post, and cursed with a face that would curdle fresh milk." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. A miner with a broken nose shouted, "Take the sack off, let's see the monster." Thaddeus shook his head, feigning a shudder. "I cannot, sir. For the sake of your stomachs, I cannot." The local doctor, Dr. Phineas O'Connell, took one look at her and said it was the mark of the devil himself. Boils, scars, one eye looking at the heaven and the other at hell. But he paused, leaning in conspiratorially. "She cooks, she cleans, and she don't talk back. Perfect for a man who likes his peace." At the back of the crowd, leaning against the rough-hewn logs of the general store, stood Gideon Holt. Gideon was a man who seemed carved from the mountain itself. Standing 6'5", with shoulders that strained the seams of his buffalo hide coat, he was a figure of local legend and local fear. They called him Grizzly when they thought he couldn't hear, and Mr. Holt when he could. His face was hidden beneath a thick, dark beard, but his eyes, steel grey and piercing, missed nothing. A long, jagged scar ran from his temple down to his jaw, a souvenir from a bear attack 3 years prior. He hadn't come to town for entertainment. He needed salt, coffee, and ammunition before the deep snows sealed off his cabin at Iron Peak. But the sight of the girl, shivering violently in the mud, anchored his boots to the ground. $2, a drunkard yelled, waving a bottle of rot-gut whiskey. $3, countered a trapper with fewer teeth than fingers. "I need someone to skin beavers. Don't matter if she's ugly." Gideon's jaw tightened. He watched the girl's hands. They weren't just shivering from cold, they were trembling with a terror so profound he could feel it in his own bones. She wasn't fighting the rope. She had given up. Thaddeus Rourke sneered at the low bids. "Come now, she's worth more than a bottle of swill. $5. Do I hear 5? The cruelty of it made Gideon's stomach turn. He had seen men die in the war, seen animals torn apart by predators, but this cold, bureaucratic dismantling of a human soul was worse. Thaddeus grabbed the rope attached to the girl's neck and yanked it. She stumbled forward, falling to her knees in the freezing mud. The crowd roared with laughter. One man kicked mud onto her skirt. Something inside Gideon snapped. It wasn't a heroic impulse or a desire for romance. It was a deep, burning rage against the bully on the box. He pushed off the wall, his spurs jingling with a heavy, ominous chime. The crowd parted instantly. You didn't stand in Gideon Holt's way. He walked to the front, his shadow swallowing Thaddeus Rourke. $50, Gideon said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder in a canyon. The silence that followed was absolute. $50 was a fortune. A man could buy a good horse, a rifle and supplies for a year with that kind of money. Thaddeus blinked, his greedy eyes widening. He looked at Gideon, then at the gold coin Gideon flipped into the air. What, 50? For the goods? For the woman, Gideon corrected, his tone icy. And for you to get out of my sight, before I forget that I'm a civilized man. Thaddeus snatched the coin from the air, biting it to test its authenticity. Sold, to the Hermit of Iron Peak. No refunds, Mr. Holt. Once the sack is off, she's your problem. Gideon didn't look at the auctioneer. He stepped toward the girl. She flinched, curling into a ball as his massive boots stopped in front of her. He could hear her ragged breathing beneath the burlap. He drew a massive bowie knife from his belt. The crowd gasped, some stepping back, expecting violence. Gideon reached down and, with a single, precise motion, sliced the rope tethering her to the hitching post. He didn't cut the bonds on her hands, nor did he remove the sack. Not here. Not in front of these wolves. Get up, he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. She struggled, slipping in the mud. He didn't grab her roughly. He extended a gloved hand, waiting. After a long, agonizing pause, she reached out. Her hand was tiny in his, her skin ice-cold. He pulled her to her feet. We're leaving. As he led her toward his pack mule and giant black stallion, midnight, the whispers started. Poor girl, the storekeep muttered, going from the devil to the beast. He'll probably eat her. Another laughed nervously. Gideon ignored them all. He hoisted the girl onto the mule, securing her so she wouldn't fall. He mounted his horse and turned his back on Dead Horse Creek. He had come for coffee and salt. He was leaving with a wife he hadn't wanted, and a mystery hidden beneath a burlap sack. The ride up the mountain was brutal. The trail to Gideon's cabin was little more than a goat path, winding along the edge of sheer cliffs, battered by winds that could freeze the moisture in a man's lungs. For the first hour, Gideon didn't speak. He rode ahead on midnight, the lead rope of the mule wrapped around his saddle horn. Every few minutes, he glanced back. The girl sat rigid, gripping the pommel of the saddle so hard her knuckles were white. The burlap sack was still over her head. He had offered to take it off once they were out of town, but when he had reached for it, she had screamed, a strangled, terrifying sound, and clamped her hands over the knot. She wanted to hide. He understood that instinct. He had been hiding on this mountain for 5 years. Storm's coming, Gideon muttered to himself, looking at the darkening sky. Heavy, slate-grey clouds were rolling over the peaks, swallowing the sun. We need to make the ridge before nightfall. He urged the horses faster. The temperature plummeted. Snow began to fall, first as gentle flakes, then as hard, driving pellets. By the time they reached the plateau where his cabin stood, the world was white. The cabin was a sturdy structure, built of massive logs, chinked with moss and mud, with a stone chimney that promised warmth. A lean-to stable stood to the side. Gideon dismounted and immediately went to the mule. The girl was shaking so violently the saddle leather creaked. She was hypothermic. Her thin rags offered no protection against this altitude. We're here, he said, his voice fighting the wind. He reached up and lifted her down. She was dead weight, her legs numb from the cold and the ride. She collapsed against his chest. For a moment, Gideon froze. He wasn't used to human contact. She felt fragile, like a bird with hollow bones. He scooped her up into his arms, carrying her effortlessly through the deepening snow. He kicked the cabin door open and shut it firmly behind them, barring it against the wind. The silence of the cabin was sudden and ringing. Embers still glowed in the hearth. Gideon deposited her in his armchair near the fire and immediately went to work building up the flames. "Don't move," he commanded, though he doubted she could if she wanted to. He threw logs onto the fire until it roared, casting dancing orange shadows against the walls adorned with furs and hunting rifles. He lit a kerosene lamp, the yellow light flooding the room. Turning back to her, he saw she hadn't moved. She was a heap of dirty fabric and misery. The water from the melting snow on the burlap sack was dripping onto her lap. "You need to get warm," Gideon said, stepping closer. "And you can't do that with a wet sack on your head." She stiffened, her hands flying up to clutch the hood again. Gideon sighed, dragging a wooden stool over to sit in front of her. He was still terrifying to look at, a giant man with a wild beard and a scar that twisted his face. But he lowered his voice, trying to sound less like a bear and more like a man. "Listen to me. My name is Gideon. I ain't gonna hurt you, and I ain't gonna laugh at you, no matter what's under there. I've seen plenty of ugly things in this world. Most of them were men in expensive suits." He saw her shoulders relax, just a fraction. "I'm going to cut the rope at your neck. It's choking you. Then I'm going to take the hood off. You understand?" She hesitated, then gave a single jerky nod. Gideon took his knife out again. The blade gleamed in the firelight. He moved slowly, telegraphing his actions. Carefully, he slid the blade between the rough rope and her bruised skin. Snick. The rope fell away. He sheathed the knife. "Okay, now the hood." His large, calloused hands reached out. He expected resistance, but she sat frozen, as if bracing for a blow. He took hold of the burlap fabric. It was scratchy and smelled of mildew. "Breathe," he whispered. He lifted the sack. Gideon braced himself. He expected a hairlip, a missing nose, severe burns. Whatever horror Thaddeus Rourke had promised. He expected a face that would justify the cruelty of the town. The sack slid off, revealing a tangle of matted, filthy golden hair. Gideon's breath hitched. The woman beneath the hood lifted her face, her eyes squeezed shut, waiting for his gasp of disgust. Gideon did gasp, but not from disgust. The air left his lungs as if he'd been kicked by a mule. She wasn't a monster. Beneath the dirt and the grime, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. High cheekbones, a delicate jawline, and skin that, though pale and bruised, had the porcelain quality of a doll. But it was when she opened her eyes that Gideon truly felt the floor drop out from under him. They were violet. A deep, startling shade of indigo violet that seemed to hold the entire night sky. There were no boils, no deformities. But there was a bruise, a dark, ugly purple mark blooming across her left cheekbone, looking fresh, and around her neck, where the rope had been, was a ring of raw, red chafing. "My God," Gideon whispered, his hand hovering near her face but not daring to touch. Why did he cover you?" The woman, this creature who looked like a fallen angel dragged through hell, stared at him with an intensity that burned. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She pointed to her throat, then to the bruise on her face, and tears began to spill from those violet eyes. Thaddeus hadn't covered her face because she was ugly. He had covered her because she was too beautiful to sell for $5, unless he convinced the world she was worthless. He had hidden her value to humiliate her, to break her spirit so completely that she would never realize her own power. And Gideon, the hermit who wanted nothing to do with the world, had just bought a treasure that men would kill for. He looked at the door, the wind rattling the hinges. He knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that Thaddeus Rourke would eventually realize his mistake. Or perhaps Rourke knew exactly what she was, and sold her because she was dangerous. "What is your name?" Gideon asked softly. She looked around the room, her eyes landing on an old, dusty book on his shelf, a copy of the Odyssey. She pointed to it. "You can read?" She nodded. Gideon fetched a piece of slate and a chalk stick he used for tallying pelts. He handed it to her. Her hand shook as she wrote 3 letters in elegant, practiced script. "Lia," Gideon read. She shook her head, tapping the slate, and wrote more, Cordelia. Cordelia, he said, testing the name. It sounded like music in the rough cabin. Cordelia. She nodded, then wrote one more sentence that chilled Gideon to the bone. He will come back. Gideon looked from the slate to the fire, his eyes hardening into flint. He stood up, walked to the gun rack, and took down his Winchester repeating rifle. He began to load it, the metallic click-clack of the cartridges, the only sound in the room. "Let him come," Gideon said. "I bought you fair and square. And up here, I am the law." The blizzard that had chased them up the mountain didn't just pass through. It settled in. For 3 weeks, Iron Peak was entirely cut off from the rest of the territory. The snow drifted 10 feet deep against the cabin walls, insulating them but also imprisoning them. The first few days were a strange dance of avoidance and necessity. Gideon was a man accustomed to the profound silence of the wilderness, but the silence Cordelia brought was different. It was heavy, loaded with unspoken trauma and a watchful intensity that unnerved him. He gave her his bed, a sturdy frame fitted with ropes and topped with a thick straw mattress and buffalo robes, while he slept on a pallet by the fire. She was terrified of him. He saw it in the way she flinched when he chopped wood indoors, the way her violet eyes tracked his massive frame whenever he moved. He was a giant, scarred and rough, and she was a porcelain doll covered in bruises. Those bruises told a story that made Gideon's blood boil hotter than his forge. The mark on her cheek faded to a sickly yellow, but the ring around her neck remained angry red for days. He caught her scratching at it absent-mindedly, her eyes unfocused and distant. He didn't pressure her to communicate. He had bought her for peace, hadn't he? That's what he told himself as he mended traps and oiled his guns in the firelight. But her presence was a constant, itching distraction. The change happened slowly. It started with the stew. Gideon was a passable cook when it came to survival. Meat, water, salt, boil until edible. One evening, he came back in from shoveling a path to the stable, frozen to the bone. The cabin smelled different. It didn't smell like burnt venison and wood smoke. It smelled like herbs. He stopped in the doorway. Cordelia was at the hearth. She had found his small, precious stash of dried sage and wild onions he'd traded for last autumn. She was stirring the pot, her movements graceful and precise, completely unlike the shivering wretch at the auction block. She turned when he entered, apprehension flickering in her eyes. She held up the ladle, offering him a taste. Gideon approached slowly, taking the ladle. He tasted it. The flavor exploded in his mouth. It was savory, rich, and actually had depth. He looked at her, surprised. "It's good," he grunted. "Real good." A small, tentative smile touched her lips. It was the first time he'd seen it. It transformed her face from merely beautiful to something breathtaking. It made his chest ache in a way the old bear scar hadn't in years. After that night, a silent truce formed. She took over the cooking and the mending. He found his woolen socks darned with neat, tiny stitches. The cabin floor was swept clean of pine needles and mud. In return, he made sure the fire never died, and he began to leave small things for her on the table. A piece of quartz he found that caught the light, a comb carved from bone to tackle the mats in her golden hair. Her hair was a chore that took 3 days. When it was finally clean and brushed out, it fell to her waist in shimmering waves, brighter than the gold coin he'd tossed at Thaddeus Rourke. They communicated through the slate. "Where are you from?" he wrote one evening. She hesitated for a long time before writing. "St. Louis." "Why Montana?" "My stepfather brought me after my mother died. He said the East was too crowded." Gideon watched her face in the firelight. "Thaddeus Rourke is not your blood." She shook her head vehemently, a look of pure loathing crossing her features. "He hurt you." It wasn't a question. Gideon's hand tightened around the slate so hard the chalk snapped. Cordelia looked down at her hands. She slowly pulled up the sleeve of the oversized wool shirt he had given her. On her delicate forearm were jagged, fading scars. Not from a whip, but marks that looked like burns from a cigar. Gideon let out a low growl that made the wolf pelt on the wall seem tame. He stood up abruptly and paced the small cabin. He needed to hit something. He needed to ride down that mountain and tear Thaddeus Rourke apart, joint by joint. He stopped in front of her. "Why can't you speak? Did he do something to your throat?" He needed to know if the damage was physical. Cordelia's hand went to her throat. Her mouth opened, her jaw working. A sound tore its way out, a dry, ragged gasp that sounded like hinges rusting shut. Her face contorted in agony, tears squeezing from her eyes. She shook her head frantically, grabbing the slate. "The words are locked inside. If I scream, I die." Gideon stared at the words. It was fear, a terror so deep it had paralyzed her voice box. "All right," he said softly, kneeling before her so he wasn't looming over her. "All right, no speaking then. We don't need words." He reached out, his large, calloused thumb gently wiping a tear from her unbruised cheek. She didn't flinch this time. She leaned just a fraction of an inch into his touch. The winter dragged on, but the isolation felt less like a prison and more like a cocoon. Gideon taught her how to load a rifle, her small fingers learning the intricate mechanics of the Winchester. He showed her how to identify tracks in the snow. Wolf, elk, cougar. She was a quick study, her intelligence shining through her silence. He realized that Thaddeus Rourke hadn't just hidden her beauty. He had tried to crush a formidable spirit. And every day on the mountain, with every chore she mastered, and every smile she dared to show, Cordelia was putting herself back together. But the fear never fully left her eyes. She spent hours staring out the small, frost-rimed window toward the valley below. "He will come back," she had written. Gideon sharpened his bowie knife until the edge could split a hair. "Let him try," he murmured to the empty air while Cordelia slept. Let him try. Down in Dead Horse Creek, the snow was turning to grey slush, mixed with the churned mud of 1,000 hoofprints. The thaw was setting in, and with it came a reckoning for Thaddeus Rourke. Thaddeus sat in the back room of the Salty Dog Saloon, nursing a lukewarm whiskey and sweating through his expensive suit. The 50 gold pieces Gideon Holt had thrown at him were long gone, lost in 3 bad nights at the faro table. But the lack of money wasn't what had him terrified. It was the telegram that had arrived yesterday, carried by a shivering rider from the nearest railhead 3 days away. The telegram was from St. Louis, from a law firm representing the estate of Cordelia's late mother. It was brief, pointed, and catastrophic for Thaddeus. Audit of Barrington, estate imminent, co-signature of Miss Cordelia Barrington, required for release of railroad bonds. Confirm her location and health immediately. Investigators dispatched. Thaddeus crunched the telegram into a ball. He wasn't her step-uncle. He was a con man who had married her sickly, wealthy mother 6 months before she conveniently died of consumption. He had dragged Cordelia out west to isolate her, to torment her into submission so she would sign over her inheritance, a fortune tied to the booming transcontinental railroad. He had broken her down, kept her locked in cellars, burned her with his cigars when she refused to sign. The trauma had struck her dumb. He thought he had won. But a week ago, in a drunken stupor brought on by debt and frustration at her obstinacy, he'd dragged her to the auction block. He wanted to humiliate her, to show her she was worthless. He'd thought selling her to some drifter would be the end of it. He could claim she ran off or died in the winter. He hadn't counted on Gideon Holt. Everyone knew Grizzly Holt. The man was a lethal recluse who owned the highest ground in the territory. Thaddeus realized with sickening clarity that he had sold the key to $1 million fortune to the most dangerous man in Montana for $50. "You look like a man whose horse just died under him, Rourke." Thaddeus jumped, nearly spilling his drink. A man had materialized in the darkened doorway of the back room. He was lean and wiry, dressed in black leather that creaked when he moved. He wore his guns tied low on his thighs, the rosewood handles worn smooth from use. His face was narrow, with eyes like chips of obsidian, and a thin mustache that did nothing to hide a cruel mouth. His name was Boone Hackett, He was a regulator, a bounty hunter, and occasionally a hired killer for the cattle barons. He didn't come cheap, and he didn't ask questions. "Mr. Hackett," Thaddeus stammered, trying to regain his composure. "Thank you for coming." Hackett pulled up a chair, spinning it around to sit straddling it. "You said you had a job paying $500. I'm listening." Thaddeus leaned in, lowering his voice. "I need you to retrieve some stolen property up on Iron Peak." Hackett let out a short, sharp laugh. "Iron Peak? That's Holt's territory. You want me to steal from Grizzly Gideon?" He shook his head. "Price just doubled. That crazy bastard skinned a bear with his own knife." $1,000, Thaddeus hissed, desperate. $1,000 gold, but the property must be returned undamaged, at least alive enough to write her name. Hackett's obsidian eyes narrowed. "Her name? You sold a woman to Holt, didn't you? I heard the talk, the mute with the sack on her head." "She's my ward," Thaddeus lied smoothly. "She was abducted. Holt, he manipulated the situation. She's unwell in the head. I need her back for her own safety." Hackett stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. He knew a liar when he saw one. But he also knew what $1,000 gold looked like. It looked like retirement in Mexico. "And Holt?" Hackett asked. "What about him?" Thaddeus Rourke smiled, the expression not reaching his greedy eyes. "Mr. Holt is an obstacle. Obstacles should be removed. Permanently." Hackett nodded slowly. "The snow is melting lower down, but the pass to Iron Peak will still be choked. I can't take a full posse up there yet. Horses will break their legs." "I don't care how you do it. I need her back before the lawyers from St. Louis get here." "Patience, Rourke," Hackett said, standing up and adjusting his gun belt. "I'll send a couple of scouts up first. Lightly packed. Good climbers. Let them test the waters. See if the grizzly is hibernating. If they can grab the girl quietly, fine. If not, they'll wake the bear, and I'll be waiting to put him down." Hackett turned and walked out into the noisy saloon. Thaddeus uncrumpled the telegram, staring at the words. He was gambling everything now. If Hackett failed, Thaddeus knew he wouldn't just be broke. He'd be dead or in prison. The stakes had just gotten lethal. Spring arrived on Iron Peak with the violence of a breaking fever. One morning, the relentless howling wind ceased, replaced by the sound of dripping water. The sun came out, blindingly bright against the white landscape, and began the slow, arduous work of melting 5 months of snow. The change in weather brought a restlessness to Gideon. The cabin felt too small. He needed to check the damage the winter had done to the timberline, to see where the game trails were reforming. Cordelia seemed lighter too. For the first time since arriving, she stepped outside without Gideon's immediate prompting. She stood on the porch, squinting in the sunlight, breathing in the scent of wet pine and thawing earth. She wore a buckskin dress Gideon had fashioned for her, clumsy but warm, cinched at her narrow waist with a leather belt. "Snow's crusty," Gideon said, joining her on the porch. He tested the surface with his boot. It held his weight. "I need to go down to the lower ridge. Check the elk herd movement. It's a half-day ride, there and back, now that the drifts are settling." He looked at her anxiously. He hadn't left her alone for more than an hour since he brought her here. Cordelia looked at him, then at the vast, open expanse of the mountain. She nodded firmly. She walked back inside and returned with the Winchester rifle, holding it with the competence he had taught her. She chambered around with a solid clack-clack. Gideon grinned, a rare, full expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "All right then. Bar the door from the inside. Don't open it for anyone but me. I'll knock 3 times. Fast." He saddled Midnight and rode out, the big black horse plunging through the crusty snow. He looked back once before disappearing into the timberline. She was still on the porch, rifle in the crook of her arm, watching him. A strange tightness gripped his chest. He didn't want to leave her. It felt wrong. He should have listened to his gut. 3 hours later, Gideon was miles away, tracking a large bull elk, when the silence of the mountain was shattered. Not by a natural sound, but by the distinct flat crack of a rifle shot echoing from the direction of his cabin. Gideon didn't hesitate. He wheeled Midnight around and kicked the horse into a gallop, heedless of the treacherous footing. The big stallion sensed his rider's panic and charged through the snow, foaming at the bit. Back at the cabin, Cordelia was fighting for her life. 2 men had appeared from the tree line an hour after Gideon left. They weren't dressed like locals. They wore trail dusters and carried expensive repeater carbines. Boone Hackett's scouts. They had left their horses below where the trail was impassable and climbed the last mile on foot. They had watched the cabin for 20 minutes, confirming Gideon was gone. They saw only a woman on the porch, sweeping snow, a small, harmless-looking woman. They got sloppy. They approached boldly, grins on their faces. "Morning, Mum," the taller one yelled. "We're looking for a lost heifer. You seen one?" Cordelia had frozen. She recognized the look in their eyes, the same predatory look Thaddeus had when he'd had too much whiskey. She remembered Gideon's rule: bar the door. She dropped the broom and bolted inside. "Hey!" the man shouted, breaking into a run. "Get her, Jeb!" They hit the door just as she dropped the heavy wooden bar into place. The door shuddered violently under their combined weight, dust raining down from the ceiling. Cordelia didn't scream. Her silence was absolute, a vacuum of terror. She grabbed the Winchester from the table. "Open up, girlie," the second man yelled, kicking the door. "We ain't gonna hurt you. Your uncle just wants you back." The mention of her uncle turned her fear into cold, hard steel. "He will come back." She didn't aim at the door. Gideon had taught her about cabin defense. Never shoot blindly through a door, Cordelia. You waste ammo and give away your position. You wait until they commit. She moved to the side of the door, pressing her back against the log wall, leveling the rifle at chest height toward the entrance. She waited. The kicking stopped. "All right, have it your way," the taller man growled. A moment later, the small window next to the door shattered inward. A gloved hand reached in, trying to lift the bar. Cordelia squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared in the small space. The slug tore through the window frame and the meat of the man's forearm. He screamed, yanking his arm back, spraying blood onto the snow outside. "You bitch! She shot me, Jeb! The mute bitch shot me! Cover me!" Jeb yelled. He fired 3 rounds blindly through the door. Wood splinters exploded inward, one slicing Cordelia's cheek, but she didn't make a sound. Jeb threw his shoulder against the door again. The wood groaned, the iron hinges straining. One more hit, and it would give. Cordelia pumped the lever of the rifle, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. She took a deep, shuddering breath, aiming dead center at the buckling door. Then, over the shouts of the men outside, she heard a sound that made her heart leap, a thunderous rhythm of hooves hammering the frozen ground, and then a roar that was purely human and terrifying. Gideon burst from the tree line on Midnight, a vengeful titan silhouetted against the sun. He didn't even slow down. The wounded man saw him first and raised his good arm to fire, but he was too slow. Gideon rode right over him, Midnight's iron-shod hooves crushing him into the snow. Jeb turned from the door, eyes wide with terror as the mountain man bore down on him. He raised his rifle, but Gideon leaned from the saddle, swinging the butt of his own heavy rifle like a club. It connected with Jeb's head with a sickening thwack. The man crumpled without a sound. Gideon yanked Midnight to a sliding halt, leaping from the saddle before the horse even stopped moving. He landed in front of the door, chest heaving, eyes wild. He kicked the unconscious Jeb away and hammered on the wood with his fist. Rap, rap, rap. 3 fast knocks. "Cordelia, it's me. Open the door." The bar lifted slowly. The door creaked open. Cordelia stood there, the Winchester still gripped tight in her hands, a trickle of blood running down her cheek from the splinter cut. Her violet eyes were huge, taking in the carnage on her doorstep. One man moaning in agony, holding a shattered arm, the other out cold in the snow. She looked up at Gideon. He was breathing hard, his beard frosted with ice from his mad dash, his eyes burning with terrified concern for her. She didn't faint. She didn't cry. She stepped out onto the porch, looked at the men who had come to drag her back to hell, and then looked at Gideon. She reached out with one trembling hand and gripped the front of his buffalo coat. She pulled him down slightly until their foreheads touched. It was an anchor in the storm. Gideon wrapped his massive arms around her, crushing her to him, burying his face in her hair. He was shaking as hard as she was. "I got you," he ground out, his voice thick with emotion. "I got you. They'll never touch you again." He pulled back, looking into her eyes. The fear was still there, but something else was mixing with it now. Fierce resolve. He looked over her shoulder at the wounded scout who was whimpering in the snow. Gideon's expression hardened into granite. "Go inside, Cordelia. Put water on for coffee. I have to clean this up." He waited until she was back inside with the door shut before he turned to the men on the ground. He wasn't going to kill them. Not yet. They had information he needed. He dragged them both toward the stable, ignoring their cries. War had come to Iron Peak, and Gideon Holt was about to show them why you never, ever wake the grizzly. The stable was dark, smelling of sweet hay and the metallic tang of fear. Gideon had tied the two scouts, Jeb and the wounded man, whose name turned out to be Silas, back to back against the center support beam. Gideon didn't torture them. He didn't have to. He simply sharpened his bowie knife on a wet stone, the rhythmic shh, shh sound echoing in the silence, while midnight stomped restlessly in his stall. "Talk," Gideon said, his voice low and vibrating with a menace that made Silas weep. "Who sent you? And how many more are coming?" "It was Rourke," Silas blubbered, clutching his bandaged arm. "Thaddeus Rourke. He hired Boone Hackett. Hackett got 6 men with him. They're coming up the switchbacks at dawn. They got dynamite, Holt. They're going to blow you out if you don't give the girl up." Gideon stopped sharpening the knife. Dynamite. That changed the tactical landscape entirely. Logs could stop bullets, but they couldn't stop blasting powder. "Why?" Gideon asked. "Why go to this trouble for a mute girl he sold for $50? "Money," Jeb spat, trying to sound tough despite the situation. "She's worth millions. Railroad bonds. She got to sign 'em. Rourke's desperate. He said he'd burn this whole mountain down to get her back before the lawyers from St. Louis find him." Gideon stood up, sheathing the knife. He had heard enough. He walked out into the blinding afternoon sun, his mind racing. He went back to the cabin. Cordelia was sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, her knuckles white. She looked up when he entered, her violet eyes searching his face for answers. "They're coming at dawn," Gideon said, not sugarcoating it. He respected her too much for lies. 8 men total, heavily armed. They have dynamite. Cordelia's breath hitched. She reached for the slate, her hands trembling. "We must run." Gideon shook his head, walking to the window to look out at the valley. "No, the snow in the high passes is still too deep for horses. We'd be on foot. They'd track us down in an hour in the open. We'd be sitting ducks." He turned to her. "We fight here. This is my land. I know every rock, every tree, every ravine. We make them pay for every step they take." He saw the terror in her eyes, the instinct of a prey animal that had been hunted for years. He walked over and knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in his large, warm ones. "Cordelia, look at me." She met his gaze. "I won't let them take you. I swear it on my life. But I need you to be strong. Can you do that? Can you be the woman who shot that man through the window?" She stared at him, the fear slowly warring with something else. Anger. The anger of a woman who had been silenced, sold, and abused. She looked at the bruise on her arm, then at Gideon's scar. She nodded. The rest of the day was a blur of grim preparation. Gideon turned the cabin into a fortress. He boarded up the windows, leaving only narrow firing slits. He distributed ammunition. He took the remaining black powder he used for reloading shells and fashioned crude explosives, burying them in the snow along the only approach to the cabin, the narrow trail that bottlenecked between 2 massive granite boulders. Night fell, bringing a suffocating darkness. They didn't light the lamps. They sat in the dark, the embers of the fire casting a dull red glow. "You should sleep," Gideon whispered. He was cleaning his Winchester for the 10th time. Cordelia moved from her chair. In the dark, she found him. She sat on the floor beside him, resting her head against his knee. It was a gesture of absolute trust. Gideon stiffened, then relaxed, his hand coming down to stroke her hair. "I never wanted a wife," he murmured into the darkness, more to himself than her. "I thought people were poison. But you're the only good thing that's ever come up this mountain." She squeezed his knee. Silence was their language, and in that moment it spoke volumes. Dawn arrived with a deceptive beauty. The sky turned a pale, bruised purple, then bled into gold. The air was crisp and still. Then a jay screeched in the distance. Gideon was instantly alert. He moved to the firing slit facing the trail. "Get down," he commanded Cordelia. "Stay low. Keep the shotgun ready." He saw them through the scope of his rifle, dark shapes moving against the white snow, about 400 yards out. Boone Hackett rode in the front, confident, his duster flapping in the morning breeze. Thaddeus Rourke was there too, looking terrified on a skittish mare, surrounded by hired guns. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. "Gideon Holt!" Hackett's voice boomed, echoing off the canyon walls. "Send the girl out. We don't have to kill you, mountain man. Just give us the property." Gideon didn't answer. He sighted down the barrel, aiming not at Hackett, but at the rock face above them. He had wedged a small charge there. He squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, hitting the explosive. Boom! An avalanche of snow and rock cascaded down, blocking the path behind them. The horses reared, screaming. The posse was trapped in the killing jar. "Now!" Gideon yelled. He began to fire. He worked the lever of the Winchester with blinding speed. Bang, click-clack, bang, click-clack. Two of the hired guns fell from their saddles before they even raised their weapons. "Cover!" Hackett screamed, diving behind a fallen log. "Blast him! Use the dynamite!" The firefight erupted. Bullets hammered the cabin logs like hail. Wood splinters filled the air. Cordelia huddled under the heavy oak table, clutching the shotgun, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. A stick of dynamite landed on the porch. "Back!" Gideon roared, diving on top of Cordelia. Crump! The explosion blew the front door off its hinges and shattered the remaining window glass. The concussion wave rattled Gideon's teeth. Smoke poured into the cabin. "They're rushing us!" Gideon coughed, scrambling up. Through the smoke, he saw 3 men charging the breached door. He shot the first one in the chest. The second one fired wildly, the bullet grazing Gideon's shoulder. Gideon grunted, stumbling back, his left arm going numb. The third man, a giant with a beard as thick as Gideon's, leaped through the smoke, tackling Gideon. They crashed to the floor, the rifle skittering away. The man pulled a knife, raising it to plunge into Gideon's chest. Gideon caught his wrist, his strength failing from the wound in his shoulder. The knife inching closer. Bang! The man's head snapped back. He collapsed onto Gideon, dead weight. Gideon shoved the body off, gasping for air. He looked up. Cordelia stood there, the shotgun smoking in her hands. She had crawled out from the table, stood her ground, and saved his life. Her eyes were wide, shocked, but fierce. "Reload," Gideon rasped, grabbing his rifle with his good hand. "It's not over." Outside, the shooting had stopped. "Holt!" It was Hackett's voice again, closer this time. "You're bleeding. I can smell it. Send her out, or the next stick goes down the chimney." Gideon looked at Cordelia. He was losing blood fast. He couldn't hold them off much longer. He looked at the back wall of the cabin. There was a loose log he kept for emergency egress, a bolt hole that led into the dense brush behind the cabin. "Cordelia," he whispered, grabbing her arm. "Listen to me. Go out the back. Go down the ravine. Hide in the wolf caves. I'll draw their fire." She shook her head violently, gripping his shirt. "Go," he roared, trying to push her. "I'm done. Save yourself." She grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to look at her. Her lips moved, forming a word she refused to speak aloud, but the shape was unmistakable. "No." She grabbed the slate from the floor, miraculously unbroken. She wrote one word in huge, jagged letters. Thaddeus. She pointed to the door. Gideon understood. It wasn't Hackett she wanted. It was the root of the rot. "You have a plan?" he asked, his voice weakening. She nodded. She pointed to Gideon's hunting horn hanging on the wall, a curled ram's horn he used to call his dogs or signal across valleys. Then she pointed to herself. She was going to use herself as bait. The silence from the cabin stretched for a long, agonizing minute. "They're dead!" Thaddeus Rourke yelled from behind a tree stump. "You killed them both, you idiot!" "Shut up, Rourke," Hackett hissed, crouching by the porch steps. "Holt is tough as leather. He's waiting." Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the smoke-filled doorway. It wasn't the giant mountain man. It was the girl. Cordelia stood on the shattered porch. Her golden hair was wild, matted with dust and blood. Not hers. Her buckskin dress was torn. She held no weapon. Her hands were raised in surrender. "Hold fire!" Hackett yelled. A grin spread across his face. Well, look who decided to join the party." Thaddeus Rourke scrambled out from his hiding spot, his greed overcoming his cowardice. "Cordelia, you ungrateful, wretched girl. Get over here." He marched toward the porch, emboldened by her empty hands. Hackett and the two remaining gunmen stayed back, guns trained on the door, waiting for Gideon. "Where is he?" Thaddeus sneered, stopping at the foot of the stairs. "Is the beast dead? Did he finally realize you weren't worth the trouble?" Cordelia looked down at him. For years, this man had been her nightmare. He had been the monster in the closet, the shadow in the hall. He had taken her voice, her inheritance, and her dignity. But looking at him now, shivering in the mountain air, his expensive suit muddy and torn, she realized something profound. He was small. He was pathetic. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking past him, to the tree line where the snow was deepest. She lowered her hands slowly. She took a deep breath. The cold air filled her lungs, stinging and invigorating. She opened her mouth. "He is right behind you." Her voice was rusty, raspy, and cracked, like a gate that hadn't been opened in a century. But it was loud, it was clear, and it carried the weight of a judge passing sentence. Thaddeus froze. His jaw dropped. You can speak." The shock was so total that he didn't register the words she had actually said. "He is right behind you." Thaddeus spun around. Gideon Holt rose from the snowbank behind the posse. He hadn't been in the cabin. He had slipped out the back bolt hole while Cordelia created the distraction, circling around the flank despite his wounded shoulder. He looked like a demon of vengeance. Blood soaked the left side of his coat. His eyes were black pits of fury. "Hackett!" Gideon roared. Hackett spun, raising his pistol, but Gideon was faster. He didn't use a gun. He threw his bowie knife. The heavy blade tumbled through the air and buried itself in Hackett's chest. The gunman looked down, surprised, before toppling backward into the slush. The other two gunmen panicked. They looked at their dead leader, then at the giant charging them with a clubbed rifle, and they broke. They dropped their guns and ran, scrambling down the mountain path, slipping and sliding in their terror. Thaddeus Rourke was left alone. He backed away, stumbling toward the edge of the cliff that dropped 500 feet into the ravine. Now, Mr. Holt, let's be reasonable. I can pay you. Double, triple." Gideon didn't stop advancing. He stepped over Hackett's body. He walked up to Thaddeus, who was now trembling so hard his knees knocked together. Gideon grabbed Thaddeus by the lapels of his ruined suit and lifted him off his feet, dangling him over the edge of the precipice. "Please!" Thaddeus squealed. "Cordelia! Tell him we're family." Gideon looked at Cordelia. She was still standing on the porch, watching. Her expression was unreadable. "Do you want him dead?" Gideon asked her, his voice rough with pain. Cordelia walked down the stairs. She walked through the snow, the hem of her dress dragging. She stopped a few feet from them. She looked into Thaddeus's weeping eyes. She cleared her throat again. It hurt, but it was a good hurt. "Let him go," she rasped. Gideon frowned, confused, but his grip loosened slightly. You want me to spare him? Cordelia shook her head. She pointed to the ground. Let him walk to prison. She stepped close to Thaddeus. Death is too easy. Gideon looked at her, and a fierce pride swelled in his chest. She didn't want revenge. She wanted justice. She wanted him to rot in a cell, knowing she had won. Gideon hauled Thaddeus back from the edge and threw him onto the hard ground. Thaddeus scrambled to get up, but Gideon planted a heavy boot on his chest. You heard the lady, Gideon growled. You're going to St. Louis, and you're going to tell the judge exactly what you did. 3 months later. The wildflowers were blooming on Iron Peak. A carpet of purple lupine and yellow arrowleaf balsam root covered the scars in the earth where the dynamite had blown. A carriage struggled up the newly widened trail. It carried a lawyer from St. Louis, a Mr. Abernathy, who looked terrified of the heights. He pulled up to the cabin. It had been repaired. The door was new, sturdy oak. Flower boxes hung under the windows. Gideon Holt was chopping wood by the stable. His shoulder was stiff, and a new scar joined the collection, but he moved with the same powerful grace. He stopped when he saw the carriage, resting his axe on the block. Cordelia came out of the cabin. She wore a dress of fine blue calico, ordered from the catalogue. She looked healthy, her cheeks flushed with colour, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by a quiet serenity. Mr. Holt! Miss Barrington! Mr. Abernathy called out, waving a sheaf of papers. I have the final documents. The transfer of the estate is complete. Mr. Rourke has been sentenced to 20 years hard labour. The bonds are yours, Miss Barrington. Cordelia smiled. She walked over to Gideon, slipping her hand into his. It is a lot of money, Abernathy said, wiping sweat from his brow. You could move back to the city, buy a mansion on the hill. Society would welcome you back. Cordelia looked at the lawyer. Then she looked up at Gideon, the mountain man who had bought her with a sack on her head, who had treated her wounds, respected her silence, and fought an army for her. She squeezed his hand. Mr. Abernathy, she said. Her voice was soft, slightly husky, but musical and strong. Why would I want a mansion? She gestured to the towering peaks, the endless blue sky, and the man beside her. I'm already home. Gideon smiled, lifting her hand to kiss her knuckles. The lawyer looked at them, shook his head in bewilderment, and climbed back into his carriage. He didn't understand. Some treasures aren't found in bank vaults. Some are found under a burlap sack in the mud of a boom town, bought for $50 and paid for in blood and love. And as the carriage rattled away, the beast of Iron Peak pulled his beauty into his arms, and for the first time in his life, Gideon Holt was completely, utterly tamed. What a journey. From the freezing mud of an auction block to the triumphant heights of Iron Peak, Cordelia and Gideon's story proves that true worth isn't in appearance, but in the spirit. Gideon thought he was buying a servant to hide from the world, but he ended up finding a partner strong enough to face it. Cordelia found her voice, not through magic, but through the safety of a love that asked for nothing in return. It's a reminder that sometimes the beast is the only one who knows how to treat a beauty, and the gentlemen are the true monsters. If this story moved you, please smash that like button. It helps us bring more emotional sagas to life. Share this video with a friend who loves a good romance with a gritty twist. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. What did you think of Cordelia's decision to jail Rourke instead of letting him die? Let me know in the comments below.